Hello, everybody. I am Corey Simpson, the Executive Artistic Director at Thunder River Theater Company in Carbondale, Colorado. And we are so excited today to have another Literature Out Loud with my friend Janice Esty, who we're going to bring on in just a moment. But we're so thrilled to have you here. And I just want to say we're all here getting through this together, and we really appreciate you joining us. So with that, let's go ahead and bring Janice on.
Hi, Corey.
Hi, Janice. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well, I got to tell you. I've been working, which is great. Can't say that about everybody. And my character at the museum that I get to do has been able to talk about the Spanish flu to the visitors there at the museum, which is a really great tie-in, and I've been lucky to be able to do it. And I just am healthy, which I credit the museum and I credit my own good sense, which is more than I can say for some people in the world. Eh?
Unfortunately, but yeah, health is a favorite word of mine right now as well. So
no kidding.
It's really great to see you on here. Before you and I chat anymore, maybe let's bring on Ed Foran and Franz Aldifer, who are your two readers today. Hi, guys.
Good morning.
Hi, Corey. Hi, Janice. Good to see you guys.
You guys are the best. They're the best.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
Our pleasure.
As well.
We're going to get started with Literature Out Loud in a moment, which, by the way, I just want to mention, and correct me if I'm wrong, Janice, but it's sponsored by Pickens County Library.
Yes, and it is sponsored by Friends of the Library, which is a group that donates money to the library for good programs, which I believe this is.
Great. So we really want to just do a quick shout out to the Pickens County, or the Friends of Pickens County Library, who helped make this happen. And this has been a really fun collaboration that we've now been doing for several months. And it's been a really fun way to get this content out maybe to some more people that might not always be able to make it to the library. So, so before we jump in on the actual the content for the readings today, I just wanted to check in with all three of you and ask. I mean, this has been just an unbelievable time, I know, for everybody. And Ed, how are things going for you, and how are you doing?
I'm good, Corey. Thanks for asking. You know, when the whole COVID thing, shelter in place, shut down on March 13th, we closed our real estate offices and really hunkered down. And I think there were some really memorable things that came out of the whole shelter in place. I think it gave nature a chance to kind of catch its breath. You know, it was kind of nice seeing less traffic. It was kind of nice not being on social media as much, and gave us all some perspective. And I'm actually looking back somewhat nostalgically on March and April when it was really quiet. Now I'm back at work in real estate and managed real estate office, and it is absolute madness. There seems to be a tremendous sort of exodus from major metropolitan areas to the mountains, and Aspen in particular, to find safe havens for their families. So it's just, it's a very strange time. I feel very fortunate. My children are healthy.
Good.
I'm healthy. And so just doing the best we can and looking forward to sharing this story with you.
All right. And how about you, Franz? How are things going with you these days?
Things are going well. For those who don't know, I am a Pickens County Sheriff's Deputy at the jail in Aspen. And that has been a whole new reality for me, obviously. The law enforcement is doing its best to not bring people to the jail, if possible. Open summons and release on the street or at the car, they'll do that. So we actually got to a point where we really didn't have that many people, 5 or 6.
Wow.
And when people do come in, we do a COVID questionnaire and take their temperatures. And as deputies now, we have been testing once a week for COVID. So basically, that's it. Population there is pretty stable, so we don't have too many people coming in and out. So it's actually probably a safer place even for the inmates in terms of staying healthy. They probably have to worry more about what the deputies might bring in as opposed to what the inmates might give the deputies.
Right, that makes sense. Well, again, we're just really happy that all three of you are here with us on ThunderStream. And Janice, thanks again for overseeing this great program. And why don't we jump into talking a little bit about the author. So Sean, if you want to bring up that title for us. Janice, maybe you can introduce a little bit about the author today. And I don't know anything about this author, and I'm curious if you can share a little bit of the background or whatever you might like to about who these two fine gentlemen are going to be reading today.
Absolutely. More than happy. Well, our author today is Frank O'Connor, as you can see there. Thank you, Sean. He was born in 1903, died in 1966. He is a well-known, believe it or not, Irish author, and writes beautifully, as Ed suggested that we use this author, and it's to his credit that he made this suggestion. He writes the gamut from light and very humorous writings to very deep and sometimes tragic things. He served in the IRA during the Irish War of Independence, and also was in the IRA during the Irish Civil War. And that's when he wrote his most well-known piece called Guest of the Nation, which deals with the ill-fated comradeship between two people in the IRA and two British prisoners, which is a pretty gritty piece of work, but it's a very well-known piece and the basis for some films, actually. Frank O'Connor was also in theater. He was briefly the managing director of the Abbey Theatre in Dublin after Yeats died. And he was in the USA for most of the 50s and 60s, taught at Stanford, actually had a stroke while he was teaching in Stanford in 1960, and died in 1966 in Dublin. But he also writes about extensive memories he had of his childhood, including a fairly abusive father and a mother who was he idolized her, and she pretty much gave her life for him. But those memories figure in extensively in the two stories that we'll be hearing today. The first one will be My Oedipus Complex, read by Franz Alderfer, which deals with a father coming back from war, and the very popular First Confession, which speaks for itself, which will be read second by Ed Foran. And I think you'll enjoy both of these pieces.
All right, thanks so much. So I think Sean, I want to just also thank Sean Jeffries, who's in the background running our ThunderStream for us today.
Yes.
So I think Sean's going to probably make us disappear, and then we're ready to start the first reading.
Thank you, Sean.
Father was in the army all through the war. The first war, I mean. So up to the age of 5, I never saw much of him. And what I saw did not worry me. Sometimes I woke and there was a big figure in khaki peering down at me from the candlelight. Sometimes in the morning I heard the slamming of the front door and the clatter of nailed boots down the cobbles of the lane. These were Father's entrances and exits. Like Santa Claus, he came and went mysteriously. In fact, I rather liked his visits, though it was an uncomfortable squeeze between Mother and him when I got into the big bed in the early morning. He smoked, which gave him a pleasant, musty smell, and shaved, an operation of astounding interest. Each time he left a trail of souvenirs, model tanks and Gurkha knives with handles made of bullet cases, and German helmets and cap badges and button sticks, and all sorts of military equipment, carefully stowed away in a long box on top of the wardrobe in case they ever came in handy. There was a bit of the magpie about Father. He expected everything to come in handy. When his back was turned, Mother let me get a chair and rummage through his treasures. She didn't seem to think so highly of them as I did. The war was the most peaceful period of my life. The window of my attic faced southeast. My mother had curtained it, but that had small effect. I always woke with the first light, and with all the responsibilities of the previous day melted, feeling myself rather like the sun, ready to illume and rejoice. Life never seemed so simple and clear and full of possibilities as then. I put my feet out from under the clothes. I called them Mrs. Left and Mrs. Right, and invented dramatic situations for them in which they discussed the problems of the day. At least Mrs. Right did. She was very demonstrative. But I hadn't the same control of Mrs. Left, so she mostly contented herself with nodding agreement. They discussed what Mother and I should do during the day, what Santa Claus should give a fellow for Christmas, and what steps should be taken to brighten the home. There was that little matter of the baby, for instance. Mother and I could never agree about that. Ours was the only house in the terrace without a new baby, and Mother said we couldn't afford one till Father came back from the war because they cost 17 and 6. That showed how simple she was. The Jennies up the road had a new baby, and everyone knew they couldn't afford 17 and 6. It was probably a cheap baby, and Mother wanted something really good. But I felt she was too exclusive. The Jennies' baby would have done us fine. Having settled my plans for the day, I got up, put a chair under the attic window, and lifted the frame high enough to stick out my head. The window overlooked the front gardens of the terrace behind ours, and beyond these it looked over a deep valley to tall red brick houses terraced up the opposite hillside, which were all still in shadow, while those at our side of the valley were all lit up, though with one long, strange shadows that made them seem unfamiliar, rigid and painted. After that, I went into Mother's room and climbed into the big bed. She woke, and I began to tell her of my schemes. By this time, though I never seemed to have noticed it, I was petrified in my nightshirt, and I thought as I talked until the last frost belted. I fell asleep beside her and woke again only when I heard her bellow in the kitchen making the breakfast. When I heard her below in the kitchen making the breakfast. After breakfast, we went into town, heard Mass at St. Augustine's, and said a prayer for Father, and did the shopping. If the afternoon was fine, we either went for a walk in the country or a visit to Mother's great friend in the convent, Mother St. Dominic. Mother had them all praying for Father, and every night, going to bed, I asked God to send him back safe from the war to us. Little indeed did I know what I was praying for. One morning, I got into the big bed, and there, sure enough, was Father in his usual Santa Claus manner. But later, instead of uniform, he put on his best blue suit, and Mother was as pleased as anything. I saw nothing to be pleased about, because out of uniform, Father was altogether less interesting. But she only beamed and explained that our prayers had been answered, and off we went to Mass to thank God for having brought Father safely home. The irony of it, that very day when he came in to dinner, he took off his boots and put on his slippers, donned the dirty old cap he wore about the house to save him from colds, crossed his legs, and began to talk gravely to Mother, who looked anxious. Naturally, I disliked her looking anxious because it destroyed her good looks. So I interrupted him. "Just a moment, Larry," she said gently. This was only what she said when we had boring visitors, so I attached no importance to it and went on talking. "Do be quiet, Larry," she said impatiently. "Don't you hear me talking to Daddy?" This was the first time I had heard those ominous words. Talking to Daddy. And I couldn't help feeling that if this was how God answered prayers, he couldn't listen to them very attentively. "Why are you talking to Daddy?" I asked, with as great a show of indifference as I could muster. "Because Daddy and I have business to discuss. Now don't interrupt again." In the afternoon, at Mother's request, Father took me for a walk. This time we went into town instead of out in the country, and I thought at first, in my usual optimistic way, that it might be an improvement. It was nothing of the sort. Father and I had quite different notions of a walk in town. He had no proper interest in trams, ships, and horses, and the only thing that seemed to divert him was talking to fellows as old as himself. When I wanted to stop, he simply went on, dragging me behind him by the hands. When he wanted to stop, I had no alternative but to do the same. I noticed that it seemed to be a sign that he wanted to stop for a long time whenever he leaned against a wall. The second time I saw him do it, I got wild. He seemed to be settling himself forever. I pulled him by the coat and trousers, but unlike Mother, who, if you were too insistent, got into a wax and said, "Larry, if you don't behave yourself, I'll give you a good slap," Father had an extraordinary capacity for amiable inattention. I sized him up and wondered, would I cry? But he seemed to be too remote to be annoyed even by that. Really, it was like going for a walk with a mountain. He either ignored the wrenching and pummeling entirely, or else glanced down with a grin of amusement from his peak. I had never met anyone so absorbed in himself as he seemed. At tea time, talking to Daddy began again, complicated this time by the fact that he had an evening paper, and every few minutes he put it down and told Mother something new out of it. I felt this was foul play. Man for man, I was prepared to compete with him any time for Mother's attention. But when he had it all made up for him by other people, it left me no chance. Several times I tried to change the subject, without success. "You must be quiet while Daddy is talking, Larry," Mother said impatiently. It was clear that she either genuinely liked talking to Father better than talking to me, or else that he had some terrible hold on her which made her afraid to admit the truth. "Mummy," I said that night when she was tucking me up, "do you think if I prayed hard, God would send Daddy back to the war?" She seemed to think about that for a moment. "No, dear," she said with a smile, "I don't think he would." "Why wouldn't he, Mummy?" "Because there isn't a war any longer, dear." "But, Mummy, couldn't God make another war if he liked?" "He wouldn't like to, dear. It's not God who makes wars, but bad people." "Oh," I said. I was disappointed about that. I began to think that God wasn't quite what he was cracked up to be. Next morning, I woke at my usual hour, feeling like a bottle of champagne. I put out my feet and invented a long conversation in which Mrs. Wright talked of the trouble she had with her own father till she put him in the home. I didn't quite know what the home was, but it sounded the right place for Father. Then I got my chair and stuck my head out of the attic window. Dawn was just breaking with a guilty air that made me feel I had caught it in the act. My head bursting with stories and schemes, I stumbled in next door, and in the half-darkness scrambled into the big bed. There was no room at Mother's side, so I had to get between her and Father. For the time being, I had forgotten about him, and for several minutes I sat bolt upright, racking my brains to know what I could do with him. He was taking up more than his fair share of the bed, and I couldn't get comfortable, so I gave him several kicks that made him grunt and stretch. He made room all right, though Mother waked and felt for me. I settled back comfortably in the warmth of the bed with my thumb in my mouth. "Mummy," I hummed loudly and contentedly. "Shh, dear," she whispered. "Don't wake Daddy." This was a new development, which threatened to be even more serious than talking to Daddy. Life without my early morning conferences was unthinkable. "Why?" I asked severely. "Because poor Daddy is tired." This seemed to me a quite inadequate reason, and I was sickened by the sentimentality of her poor Daddy. I never liked that sort of gush. It always struck me as insincere. "Oh," I said lightly. Then in my most whining voice, "Do you know where I want to go with you today, Mummy?" "No, dear," she sighed. "I want to go down the glen and fish for thornybacks with my new net, and then I want to go out to the Fox and Hounds and—" "Don't wake Daddy," she hissed angrily, clapping her hands across my mouth. But it was too late. He was awake, or nearly so. He grunted and reached for the matches. Then he stared incredulously at his watch. "Like a cup of tea, dear?" asked Mother in a meek, hushed voice I had never heard her use before. It sounded almost as though she were afraid. "Tea?" he exclaimed indignantly. "Do you know what time it is? And after that, I want to go up to the Rathcooney Road," I said loudly, afraid I'd get something in all those interruptions. Afraid I'd forget something in all those interruptions. "Go to sleep at once, Larry," she said sharply. I began to snivel. I couldn't concentrate the way that pair went on, and smothering my early morning schemes was like burying a family from the cradle. Father said nothing, but lit his pipe and sucked it, looking out into the shadows without minding Mother or me. I knew he was mad. Every time I made a remark, Mother hushed me irritably. I was mortified. I felt it wasn't fair. There was even something sinister in it. Every time I had pointed out to her the waste of making two beds when we could both sleep in one, she had told me it was healthier like that. And now here was this man, this stranger, sleeping with her without the least regard for her health. He got up early and made tea. But though he brought Mother a cup of tea, he brought none for me. "Mummy," I shouted. "I want a cup of tea too." "Yes, dear," she said patiently. "You can drink from Mummy's saucer." That settled it. Either Father or I would have to leave the house. I didn't want to drink from Mother's saucer. I wanted to be treated as an equal in my own home, so just to spite her, I drank it all and left none for her. She took that quietly, too, but that night, when she was putting me to bed, she said gently, "Larry, I want you to promise me something." "What is it?" I said. "Not to come in and disturb poor Daddy in the morning. Promise?" Poor Daddy again. I was becoming suspicious of everything involving that quite impossible man. "Why?" I asked. "Because poor Daddy is worried and tired, and he doesn't sleep well." "Why doesn't he, Mummy?" "Well, you know, don't you, that while he was at the war, Mummy got the pennies from the post office?" "From Miss McCarthy?" "That's right. But now, you see, Miss McCarthy hasn't any more pennies, so Daddy must go out and find us some. You know what would happen if he couldn't?" "No," I said. "Tell us." "Well, I think we might have to go out and beg for them, like poor old women on Fridays. We wouldn't like that, would we?" "No," I agreed, "we wouldn't. So you'll promise not to come in and wake him. Promise?" "Promise." Mind you, I meant that. I knew pennies were a serious matter, and I was all against having to go out and beg like the old woman on Fridays. Mother laid out all my toys in a complete ring around the bed so that whatever way I got out, I was bound to fall over one of them. When I woke, I remembered my promise all night. I got up and sat on the floor and played for hours, it seemed to me. Then I got my chair and looked out the attic window for more hours. I wish it was time for Father to wake. I wished someone would make me a cup of tea. I didn't feel in the least like the sun. Instead, I was bored and so very, very cold. I simply longed for the warmth and depth of the big feather bed. At last, I could stand it no longer. I went into the next room. As there was still no room at Mother's side, I climbed over her, and she woke with a start. "Larry," she whispered, gripping my arm very tightly. "What did you promise?" "But I did, Mummy," I wailed, caught in the very act. "I was quiet for ever so long." "Oh dear, and you're perished," she said sadly, feeling me all over. "Now, if I let you stay, will you promise not to talk?" "But I want to talk, Mommy," I wailed. "That has nothing to do with it," she said with a firmness that was new to me. "Daddy wants to sleep. Now, do you understand that?" I understood it only too well. I wanted to talk. He wanted to sleep. Whose house was it anyway? "Mummy," I said with equal firmness, "I think it would be healthier for Daddy to sleep in his own bed." That seemed to stagger her, because she said nothing for a while. "Now, once for all," she went on, "you're to be perfectly quiet or go back to your own bed. Which is it to be?" The injustice of it got me down. I had convicted her out of her own mouth of inconsistency and unreasonableness, and she hadn't even attempted to reply. Full of spite, I gave Father a kick, which she didn't notice, but which made him grunt and open his eyes in alarm. "What is it?" he asked in a panic-stricken voice, not looking at Mother, but at the door as if he saw someone there. "It's early yet," she replied soothingly. "It's only the child. Go to sleep again. Now, Larry," she added, getting out of bed, "you've awakened Daddy, and you must go back." This time, for all her quiet air, I knew she meant it, and I knew that my principal rights and privileges were as good as lost unless I asserted them at once. As she lifted me, I gave a screech, enough to wake the dead, not to mind Father. He groaned. "Damn that child! Doesn't he ever sleep?" "It's only a habit, dear," she said quietly, though I could see she was vexed. "Well, it's time he got out of it," shouted Father, beginning to heave in the bed. He suddenly gathered all the bedclothes around him, turned to the wall, and then looked back over his shoulder with nothing showing, only two small, spiteful, dark eyes. The man looked very wicked. To open the bedroom door, Mother had to let me down, and she broke free and dashed for the farthest corner, screeching. Father sat bolt upright in bed. "Shut up, you little puppy," she said in a choking voice. I was so astonished that I stopped screeching. Never had anyone spoken to me in that tone before. I looked at him incredulously and saw his face convulsed with rage. It was only then that I fully realized how God had codded me, listening to my prayers for safe return of this monster. "Shut up, you!" I bawled beside myself. "What's that you said?" shouted Father, making a wild leap out of the bed. "Mick, Mick," cried Mother. "Don't you see? The child isn't used to you." "I see he's better fed than taught," snarled Father, waving his arms wildly. "He wants his bottom smacked." All his previous shouting was as nothing to see these obscene words referring to my person. They really made my blood boil. Smack your own, I screamed hysterically. Smack your own. Shut up. Shut up. At this, he lost his patience and let fly at me. He did it with lack of conviction. He did it with the lack of conviction you'd expect of a man under Mother's horrified eyes, and it ended up as a mere tap. But the sheer indignity of being struck at all by a stranger, a total stranger, who had cajoled his way back from the war into our big bed as a result of my innocent intercession, made me completely dotty. I shrieked and danced in my bare feet, and Father, looking awkward and hairy in nothing but a short gray army shirt, glared down at me like a mountain out for murder. I think it must have been then that I realized he was jealous too. And there stood Mother in her nightdress, looking as if her heart was broken between us. I hoped she felt as she looked. It seemed to me that she deserved it all. From that morning out, my life was hell. Father and I were enemies, open and avowed. We conducted a series of skirmishes against one another, he trying to steal my time with Mother, and I his. When she was sitting on my bed telling me stories, he took to looking for some pair of old boots which he alleged he had left behind him at the beginning of the war. While he talked to Mother, I played loudly with my toys to show my total lack of concern. He created a terrible scene one evening when he came in from work and found me at his box playing with his regimental badges, Gurkha knives, and button sticks. Mother got up and took the box from me. You mustn't play with Daddy's toys unless he lets you, Larry, she said severely. Daddy doesn't play with yours. For some reason, Father looked at her as if she had struck him and then turned away with a scowl. Those are not toys, he growled, taking down the box again to see if I had lifted anything. Some of those are curios and are very rare and valuable. But as time went on, I saw more and more how he managed to alienate Mother and me. What made it worse was that I couldn't grasp his method or see what attraction he had for Mother. In every possible way, he was less winning than that. He had a common accent and made noises at his tea. I thought for a while that it might be the newspapers she was interested in, so I made up bits of news of my own to read to her. Then I thought it might be the smoking, which I personally thought attractive, and took his pipes and went round the house, dribbling into them till he caught me. I even made noises at my tea, but Mother only told me I was disgusting. It all seemed to hinge round that unhealthy habit of sleeping together. So I made a point of dropping into their bed and nosing around, talking to myself, so that they wouldn't know I was watching them. But they were never up to anything that I could see. In the end, it beat me. It seemed to depend on being grown up and giving people rings, and I realized I'd have to wait. But at that moment, at that time, I wanted to see him, that I was only waiting, not giving up the fight. I wanted him to see that I was only waiting, not giving up the fight. One evening when he was being particularly obnoxious, chattering away well above my head, I let him have it. Mummy, I said, do you know what I'm going to do when I grow up? No, dear, she replied. What? I'm going to marry you, I said quietly. Father gave a great guffaw out of him, but he didn't take me in. I knew it must only be pretense, and Mother, in spite of everything, was pleased. I felt she was probably relieved to know that one day Father's hold on her would be broken. Won't that be nice? She said with a smile. It'll be very nice, I said confidently, because we're going to have lots and lots of babies. That's right, dear, she said placidly. I think we'll have one soon, and then you'll have plenty of company. I was no end pleased about that, because it showed that in spite of the way she gave in to father, she still considered my wishes. Besides, it would put the Jennies in their place. It didn't turn out like that, though. To begin with, she was very preoccupied. I supposed about where she would get the 17 and 6, and though father took to staying out late in the evenings, it did me no particular good. She stopped taking me for walks, became as touchy as blazes, and smacked me for nothing at all. Sometimes I wished I'd never mentioned the confounded baby. I seemed to have a genius for bringing calamity on myself. And calamity it was. Sonny arrived in the most appalling hullabaloo. Even that much he couldn't do without a fuss. And from the first moment, I disliked him. He was a difficult child. So far as I was concerned, he was always difficult and demanded far too much attention. Mother was simply silly about him and couldn't see when he was only showing off. As company, he was worse than useless. He slept all day, and I had to go around the house on tiptoe to avoid waking him. It wasn't any longer a question of not waking father. The slogan now was, "Don't wake Sonny." I couldn't understand why the child wouldn't sleep at the proper time. So whenever mother's back was turned, I woke him. Sometimes to keep him awake, I pinched him as well. Mother caught me at it one day, and she gave me a most unmerciful flacking. One evening, when father was coming in from work, I was playing trains in the front garden. I let on not to notice him. Instead, I pretended to be talking to myself and said in a loud voice, "If another bloody baby comes into this house, I'm going out." Father stopped dead and looked at me over his shoulder. "What's that you said?" he asked sternly. "I was only talking to myself," I replied, trying to conceal my panic. "It's private." He turned and went in without a word. Mind you, I intended it as a solemn warning, but its effect was quite different. Father started being quite nice to me. I could understand that, of course. Mother was quite sickening about Sonny. Even at mealtime, she'd get up and gawk at him in the cradle with an idiotic smile, and tell father to do the same. He was always polite about it, but he looked so puzzled. You could see he didn't know what she was talking about. He complained of the way Sonny cried at night, but she only got cross and said that Sonny never cried except when there was something up with him, which was a flaming lie, because Sonny never had anything up with him and only cried for attention. It was really painful to see how simple-minded she was. Father wasn't attractive, but he had a fine intelligence. He saw through Sonny, and now he knew that I saw through him as well. One night I woke with a start. There was someone beside me in the bed. For one wild moment, I felt sure it must be Mother, having come to her senses, and Father for good. Having come to her senses and left father for good. But then I heard Sonny in convulsions in the next room, and Mother saying, "There, there, there." And I knew it wasn't she. It was father. He was lying beside me, wide awake, breathing hard and apparently mad as hell. After a while, it came to me what he was mad about. It was now his turn. After turning me out of the bed, he had been turned out himself. He had no consideration now for anyone but that poisonous pup, Sonny. I couldn't help feeling sorry for father. I had been through it all myself, and even at that age, I was magnanimous. I began to stroke him down and say, "There, there." He wasn't exactly responsive. Aren't you asleep either? He snarled. Come on and put your arm around us, can't you? I said, and he did in a sort of way. Gingerly, I suppose, is how you would describe it. He was very bony, but better than nothing. At Christmas, he went out of his way to buy me a really nice model railway. Ladies and gentlemen, that completes the reading of my Oedipus Complex by Frank O'Connor. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce the wonderful Ed Foran.
Thank you, Franz. Well done.
Thank you.
Frank, I'm very pleased.
I'm going to run off to work. Thank you for the kind words. And I'm sorry I can't stay, but have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Great to see you.
As well. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm about to read First Confession by Frank O'Connor. All the trouble began when my grandfather died and my grandmother, my father's mother, came to live with us. Relations in the one house are a strain at the best of times, but to make matters worse, my grandmother was a real old country woman and quite unsuited to the life in town. She had a fat, wrinkled old face and, to mother's great indignation, went round the house in bare feet. The boots had her crippled. She said, for dinner she had a jug of porter and a pot of potatoes and sometimes a bit of saltfish. And she poured out the potatoes on the table and ate them slowly with great relish, using her fingers by way of a fork. Now, girls are supposed to be fastidious, but I was the one who suffered most from this. Nora, my sister, just sucked up to the old woman for the penny she got every Friday out of the old age pension. A thing I could not do. I was too honest. That was my trouble. And when I was playing with Bill Connell and the sergeant major's son and saw my grandmother staring up the path with the jug of porter sticking out from beneath her shawl, I was mortified. I made excuses not to let him come into the house because I could never be sure what she would be up to when we went in. When mother was at work and my grandmother made the dinner, I wouldn't touch it. Nora once tried to make me, but I hid from under the table from her and took the bread knife with me for protection. Nora let on to be very indignant. She wasn't, of course, but she knew mother saw through her, so she sided with Gran and came after me. I lashed out at her with the bread knife, and after she left me alone, I stayed there till mother came in from work and made my dinner. But when father came in later, Nora said in a shocked voice, "Oh, Dada, do you know what Jackie did at dinner time?" Then, of course, it all came out. Father gave me a flaking. Mother interfered, and for days after that, he didn't speak to me, and my mother barely spoke to Nora. And all because of that old woman. God knows I was heart-scalded. Then to crown my misfortunes, I had to make my first confession and communion. And it was an old woman called Ryan who prepared us for these. She was about the one age with Gran. She was well-to-do, lived in a big house on Montenot, wore a black coat and bonnet, and came every day to school at 3 o'clock when we should have been going home, and talked to us of hell. She may have mentioned the other place as well, but that could only have been by accident, for hell had the first place in her heart. She lit a candle, took out a new half-crown, and offered it to the first boy who would hold one finger, only one finger, in the flame for 5 minutes by the school clock. Being always very ambitious, I was tempted to volunteer, but I thought it might look greedy. Then she asked, were we afraid of holding one finger, only one finger, in a little candle flame for 5 minutes, and not afraid of burning all over in roaring hot furnaces for all eternity? All eternity. Just think of that. A whole lifetime goes by and it's nothing, not even a drop in the ocean of your suffering. The woman was really interesting about hell, but my attention was all fixed on the half-crown. At the end of the lesson, she put it back in her purse. It was a real disappointment. A religious woman like that. You wouldn't think she'd bother about a thing like a half-crown. Another day, she said she knew a priest who woke one night to find a fellow he didn't recognize leaning over the end of his bed. The priest was a bit frightened, naturally enough, but he asked the fellow what he wanted, and the fellow said in a deep, husky voice that he wanted to go to confession. The priest said it was an awkward time and wouldn't it do in the morning, but the fellow said that the last time he went to confession, there was one sin he kept back, being ashamed to mention it, and now it was always on his mind. Then the priest knew it was a bad case, because the fellow was after making a bad confession and committing a mortal sin. He got up to dress, and just then the cock crew in the yard outside, and lo and behold, when the priest looked around, there was no sign of the fellow, only a smell of burning timber. And when the priest looked at his bed, didn't he see the print of 2 hands burned in it? That was because the fellow had made a bad confession. The story made a shocking impression on me. But the worst of all was when she showed us how to examine our conscience. Did we take the name of the Lord our God in vain? Did we honor our father and our mother? I asked her, did this include grandmothers? And she said it did. Did we love our neighbor as ourselves? Did we covet our neighbor's goods? I thought of the way I felt about the penny that Nora got every Friday. I decided that between one thing or another, I must have broken the whole 10 Commandments, all on the account of that old woman. And so far as I could see, so long as she remained in the house, I had no hope of ever doing anything else. I was scared to death of confession. The day the whole class went, I let on to have a toothache, hoping my absence wouldn't be noticed. But at 3 o'clock, just as I was feeling safe, along comes a chap with a message from Mrs. Ryan that I was to go to confession myself on Saturday and be at the chapel for communion with the rest. To make it worse, Mother couldn't come with me and sent Nora instead. Now that girl had a way of tormenting me that Mother never knew of. She held my hand as we went down the hill, smiling sadly and saying how sorry she was for me. And she was as if she was bringing me to the hospital for an operation. Oh, God help us, she moaned. Isn't it a terrible pity you weren't a good boy? Oh, Jackie, my heart bleeds for you. How will you ever think of all of your sins? Don't forget you have to tell him about the time you kicked Gran in the shin. Let me go, I said, trying to drag myself free of her. I don't want to go to confession at all. But sure you have to go to confession, Jackie, she replied in the same regretful tone. Sure, if you didn't, the parish priest would be up to the house looking for you. 'Tisn't God knows that I'm not sorry for you. Do you remember the time you tried to kill me with the bread knife under the table and the language you used to me? I don't know what he'll do with you at all, Jackie. He might have to send you up to the bishop. I remember thinking bitterly that she didn't know the half of it, of what I had to tell. If I told it, I knew I couldn't tell it, and understood perfectly why the fellow in Mrs. Ryan's story made a bad confession. It seemed to me a great shame that people wouldn't stop criticizing him. I remember that steep hill down to the church and the sunlit hillsides beyond the valley of the river, which I saw in the gaps between the houses like Adam's last glimpse of paradise. Then when she had maneuvered me down the long flight of steps to the chapel yard, Nora suddenly changed her tone. She became the raging, malicious devil she really was. There you are, she said with a yelp of triumph, hurling me through the church door. And I hope he'll give you the penitential psalms, you dirty little caffler. I knew then I was lost, given up to eternal justice. The door with the colored glass panels swung shut behind me. The sunlight went out and gave place to deep shadow, and the wind whistled outside so that the silence which within seemed to crackle like ice under my feet. Nora sat in front of me by the confession box. There were a couple of old women ahead of her, and then a miserable-looking poor devil came in and wedged me in at the other side so that I couldn't escape, even if I had the courage. He joined his hands and rolled his eyes in the direction of the roof, muttering aspirations in an anguished tone, and I wondered, had he a grandmother too? Only a grandmother could account for a fellow behaving in the heartbroken way, but he was better off than I, for at least he could go and confess his sins. while I could make a bad confession and then die in the night and be continually coming back and burning people's furniture. Nora's turn came, and I heard the sound of something slamming, and then her voice as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth, and then another slam, and out she came. God, the hypocrisy of women. Her eyes were lowered, her head was bowed, and her hands were joined very low on her stomach. And she walked up the aisle to the side altar looking like a saint. You never saw such an exhibition of devotion. And I remembered the devilish malice with which she had tormented me all the way from our door, and wondered were all religious people like that. Really, it was my turn now. With the fear of damnation in my soul, I went in, and the confessional doors closed of itself behind me. It was pitch dark, and I couldn't see priest or anything else. Then I really began to get frightened. In the darkness, it was a matter to be between God and me, and he had all the odds. He knew what my intentions were before I even started. I had no chance. All I ever been told about confession got mixed up in my mind. And I knelt to one wall and I said, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. This is my first confession." I waited for a few minutes, but nothing happened. So I tried it on the other wall. Nothing happened there either. He had me spotted all right. It must have been then that I noticed the shelf at about one height with my head. It was really a place for grown-up people to rest their elbows, but in my distracted state, I thought it was probably the place you were supposed to kneel. Of course, I was on the high side and not very deep, but I was always good at climbing and managed to get up all right. Staying up there was trouble. There was room only for my knees and nothing you could get a grip on but a sort of wooden molding a bit above it. I held on to the molding, repeated the words a little louder, and this time something happened all right. A slide was slammed back. A little light entered the box, and a man's voice said, "Who's there?" "'Tis me, Father," I said, for fear he mightn't see me and go away again. I couldn't see him at all. The place the voice came from was under the molding, about level with my knees. So I took a good grip of the molding and swung myself down till I saw the astonished face of a young priest looking up at me. He had to put his head on the other side to see me, and I had to put mine on one side to see him. So we were more or less talking to one another upside down. It struck me as a queer way of hearing confessions, but I didn't feel it my place to criticize. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. This is my first confession," I rattled off in one breath and swung myself down the least shade more to make it easier for him. "What are you doing up there?" he shouted in an angry voice. And the strain of the politeness was putting on my hold of the molding, and the shock of being addressed in such an uncivil tone were too much for me. I lost my grip, tumbled, and hit the floor in an unmerciful wallop before I found myself flat on my back in the middle of the aisle. The people who had been waiting stood up with their mouths open. The priest opened the door of the middle box and came out, pushing his beretta back from his forehead. He looked something terrible. Then Nora came scampering down the aisle. "Oh, you dirty little caffler," she said. "I might have known you'd do it. I might have known you'd disgrace me. I can't leave you out of my sight for 1 minute." Before I could even get to my feet to defend myself, she bent down and gave me a clip across the ear. This reminded me that I was so stunned I'd even forgotten to cry, so that people might think I wasn't hurt at all, when in fact I was probably maimed for life. I gave a roar out of me. "What's all this about?" the priest hissed, getting angrier than ever and pushing Nora off me. "How dare you hit a child like that, you little vixen?" "But I can't do my penance with him, Father," Nora cried, cocking an outraged eye up at him. "Well, go and do it, or I'll give you some more to do," he said, giving me a hand up. "Was it coming to confession you were, my poor man?" he asked me. "'Twas, Father," I said with a sob. "Oh," he said respectfully, "a big hefty fellow like you must have terrible sins. Is this your first?" "'Tis, Father," said I. "Worse and worse," he said gloomily. "The crimes of a lifetime. I don't know will I get rid of you all at all today. You better wait now till I'm finished with these old ones. You can see by the looks of them they haven't much to tell." "I will, Father," I said with something approaching joy. The relief of it was really enormous. Nora stuck out her tongue at me from behind his back, but I couldn't even be bothered retorting. I knew from the very moment that man opened his mouth that he was intelligent above the ordinary. When I had time to think, I saw how right I was. It only stood to reason that a fellow confessing after 7 years would have more to tell than people that went every week. The crimes of a lifetime, exactly as he said. It was only what he expected, and the rest was the cackle of old women and girls with their talk of hell, the bishop, and the penitential psalms. That was all they knew. I started to make my examination of conscience, and barring the one bad business of my grandmother, it didn't seem too bad. The next time the priest steered me into the confession box myself and left the shutter back the way I could see him and sit down at the further side of the grill from me. Well, now, he said, what do they call you? Jackie, Father, said I. And what's the trouble to you, Jackie? Father, I said, feeling I might as well get it over a while. I had him in good humor. I had it all arranged to kill my grandmother. He seemed a good bit shaken by that, all right, because he said nothing for quite a while. My goodness, he said at last. That'd be a shocking thing to do. What put that into your head? Father, I said, feeling very sorry for myself. She's an awful woman. Is she? He asked. What way is she awful? She takes porter, Father. I said, knowing well from the way Mother talked of it, that it was a mortal sin, and hoping it would make the priest take a more favorable view of my case. Oh my, he said, and I could see he was impressed. It's enough, Father, said I. Oh, that's a bad case, sure enough, Jackie, he said. And she goes round in her bare feet, Father. I went on in a rush of self-pity. And she knows I don't like her, and she gives pennies to Nora and none to me, and my da sides with her and flakes me. And one night I was so hard-scalded, I made up my mind I'd have to kill her. And what would you do with the body, Jackie? He asked with great interest. I was thinking I'd chop that up and carry it away in a barrel I have. Begor, Jackie, he said. Do you know you're a terrible child? I know, Father. I said, for I was thinking that the same thing myself. I tried to kill Nora too, with a bread knife under the table, only I missed her. Is that the little girl that was beating you just now? He asked. 'Tis, Father. Oh, someone will go for her with a bread knife one day, and he won't miss her, he said rather cryptically. You must have great courage. Between ourselves, there's a lot of people I'd like to do the same to, but I'd never have the nerve. Hanging is an awful death. Is it, Father? I asked with the deepest interest. I was always very keen on hanging. Did you ever see a fellow hanged? Oh, dozens of them, he said solemnly. And they all died roaring. Jay, I said. Oh, a horrible death, he said with great satisfaction. Lots of the fellows I saw killed the grandmothers too, but they all said 'twas never worth it. He had me there for a full 10 minutes talking, and then walked out the chapel yard with me. I was genuinely sorry to part with him because he was the most entertaining character I'd ever met in the religious line. Outside, after the shadow of the church, the sunlight was like the roaring of waves on a beach. It dazzled me. And when the frozen silence melted and I heard the screech of trams on the road, my heart soared. I knew how he wouldn't die in the night and come back, leaving marks on my mother's furniture. It would be a great worry to her, and the poor soul had enough. Nora was sitting on the railing waiting for me, and she put on a very sour puss. And when she saw the priest with me, she was mad jealous because the priest had never come out of the church with her. Well, she asked coldly after he left me, what did he give you? 3 Hail Marys, I said. 3 Hail Marys, she repeated incredulously. You mustn't have told him anything. I told him everything, I said confidently. About Gran and all. All she wanted was to be able to go home and say I'd made a bad confession. Did you tell him you went for me with the bread knife? She asked with a frown. I did, to be sure. And he only gave you 3 Hail Marys. That's all. She slowly got down from the railing with a baffled air. Clearly, this was beyond her. And we mounted the steps back to the main road. She looked at me suspiciously. What are you sucking? She said. Bullseyes. Was it the priest that gave him to you? 'Twas. Lord God, she wailed bitterly. Some people have all the luck. 'Tis no advantage to anybody trying to be good. I might just as well be a sinner like you. Thank you, everyone, for joining me and sharing a little Franco Cotter in First Confession.
Oh, Ed, I want to meet that priest in the worst way.
Me too. The priests I knew were never that nice.
Well, you're that nice, and thank you for doing such a beautiful job reading that. That was so great.
My
Sitting
pleasure.
all by myself, hooping and hollering over here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I want to let everybody know that as of next month, Literature Out Loud is going to have a time change. Corey Simpson, who knows his stuff, has suggested that we meet in the evening. So we're going to meet on the third Wednesday of every month at 7 p.m. So you can grab a nice beverage, settle yourself in, and put your feet up. And that way your Sunday afternoon can be for a nice hike. So we'll look for you on Wednesday, August 19th, when Eileen Seeley and I will be reading some of the words of Edith Wharton, who was a socialite and the first female winner of the Pulitzer Prize. So you can't beat that. And I would like, as always, to thank Thunder Rivers Theater and particularly Sean for making our program possible. Thank you very much. And we'll look for you on the 19th of August, 7 p.m. Bring me a glass of wine, Ed, will you? Okay.